I moved to the city 2 years ago. I found a job in a small office. The work is not easy, but I try my best every day. I live alone in a tiny room near the bus stop. At night, I often eat noodles and watch TV. Sometimes I hear people laughing outside. It makes me feel a little lonely. Last Friday evening, my phone rang. It was my father. He does not call very often. "Hello, Dad," I said. "Hi, May," he said. "Are you doing well?" "I'm fine," I answered quickly. "Are you eating enough?" "Yes, I am." He was silent for a few seconds. Then he said, "You sound tired." I smiled, even though he could not see me. "I'm okay, Dad, just busy." He laughed softly. "Busy is good," he said, "but don't forget to rest." I looked at the messy desk beside me. Papers, coffee cups, and half-open books were everywhere. "I will," I said, though I didn't really mean it. Then he said something I did not expect. "I will come to see you this weekend." My hand stopped. "You will come here?" I asked. "Yes," he said. "I want to see my daughter's city." I didn't know what to say. My father lives in a small village far from here. He has never been to the city. He doesn't like noise or tall buildings. He likes quiet mornings and the sound of birds. I looked around my little room. The floor was clean, but the paint on the wall was old. The curtain was thin, and the light from the street came through at night. Would he like it here? Would he think I was living too simply? I felt a small fear in my chest. "That's great, Dad," I said finally. "When will you come?" "Saturday morning," he said. "Don't worry, I already bought the ticket." I smiled again, but my heart was beating fast. "Okay, Dad, I'll meet you at the station." After I hung up, I sat on my bed for a long time. I looked out the window. The lights of the city were bright and cold. Cars moved like little stars on the road. I thought of my father's face, dark from years of work in the sun. He always smiled when he saw me. Even when he was tired, I took a deep breath. I wanted him to be proud. I wanted him to see that I could take care of myself. So I stood up and started cleaning the room again. I folded the clothes, washed the dishes, and even bought new flowers for the table. That night, I could not sleep well. I kept thinking of him walking in the busy city, holding his old bag. He would probably look around with wonder. And maybe, just maybe, he would look at me and think, "My daughter has grown up." Saturday morning, I woke up early. The sky was still grey. I cleaned the table again, even though it was already clean. Then I looked in the mirror. My hair was messy. I tied it up quickly and put on a clean shirt. When I arrived at the train station, I saw many people. Some were carrying big suitcases, some were talking loudly. I looked around, trying to find my father. Then I saw him. He was standing near the gate, holding a small cloth bag. He wore his old brown coat, the one I had seen since I was a child. His hair was a little whiter now, but his smile was the same. "Dad!" I waved my hand. He turned and his eyes lit up. "May!" he said. His voice was warm and full of life. I ran to him and took his bag. "It's heavy," I said. He shook his head. "No, it's fine, I'm strong." I laughed. "You always say that." We took the bus to my apartment. He sat by the window and looked outside all the way. Tall buildings, busy streets, colorful shops. Everything was new to him. He said softly, "So many cars, so many people." "Yes," I said, "it's always like this here." When we reached my place, I opened the door and felt a little shy. "It's small," I said, "but it's home." He walked in slowly and looked around. The room was neat and bright. There were flowers on the table and sunlight on the floor. He nodded. "It's nice, very clean." "Thanks," I said. a little relieved. He sat down and looked at the photos on my wall. There was one of me at work, smiling with my co-workers. "You look happy there," he said. I smiled. "Yes, sometimes." He looked at me again. "Sometimes." I didn't answer. That evening I took him to a noodle shop near my building. It was small but cozy. We sat by the window. I ordered beef noodles for him. When the bowl came, he picked up the chopsticks and took a bite. He chewed slowly and said, "Not bad." I smiled. "You like it?" He nodded. "It's okay, but not as good as the noodles at home." I laughed. "I knew you would say that." He laughed too, and for a moment the noise of the city faded away. After dinner we walked back under the street lights. The wind was cool and his steps were slow. He looked up at the tall buildings again and said, "The city is so big." "Yes," I said softly, "but it can also feel very small." He didn't understand what I meant, and I didn't explain. When we got home, he sat on the bed and said, "You've grown up, May." I smiled. "Maybe a little." He nodded, looking proud and tired. At the same time, I made him some tea. He took a sip and said, "Tastes like home." That night, when he fell asleep, I sat by the window again. Outside, the lights were still bright, but tonight they felt a little warmer. The next morning, the sky was clear. I opened the window and sunlight filled the room. My father was already awake. He was folding his blanket carefully, like he always did at home. "Morning, Dad," I said. "Morning," he said with a smile. "You slept late." I laughed. "Yes, the bed was too warm." He nodded. "Good. You need rest." After breakfast, I asked, "Do you want to go out?" He looked happy. "Where?" "There's a park nearby. It's quiet and nice." He said, "Let's go." We walked side by side. The street was full of people hurrying to work. My father looked around with curiosity. He pointed at a tall glass building and said, "Is that your office?" "No," I said. "Mine is smaller." He nodded and smiled. "Still, you work hard. That's what matters." When we reached the park, the air felt fresh. Children were running, people were walking dogs. The sound of leaves moved softly in the wind. We sat on a bench under a big tree. My father watched a little boy ride a bicycle. "He looks like you when you were small," he said. I smiled. "I fell so many times." He laughed. "Yes, you always cried, but you always tried again." For a moment, we just sat there quietly. I could hear the birds singing. Then he looked at me. "You look tired," he said. I looked away. "Work is busy." He didn't say anything at first. Then he spoke slowly. "You don't have to do everything alone." His voice was calm, but it went straight to my heart. I said softly, "It's okay, Dad. I'm used to it." He sighed. "Still, I worry." I smiled. "You always worry." "Yes," he said. "That's what fathers do." The wind blew through the trees. I looked at his hands, strong, rough, a little dry. Those were the hands that built our house, cooked our meals, fixed everything that broke. Now they rested quietly on his knees. After a while, he asked, "Do you like living here?" I thought for a moment. "I don't know," I said honestly. "It's busy, it's hard, but I'm learning." He nodded. "That's good. Life is not easy anywhere, but you must find your way." When we stood up to leave, he looked at the sky. "So many clouds," he said, "but the sun is strong." "Yes," I said, "just like you." He laughed softly. "You talk sweet today." I smiled. "Maybe I learned it from you." We walked back slowly. He stopped once to buy roasted chestnuts from a street vendor. He gave me one. It was hot in my hand. "Be careful," he said. I peeled it and took a bite. It was sweet, warm and soft. Just like that moment. The next evening came too fast. My father would leave early the next morning. After dinner, we sat by the window. The city lights shone outside, soft and yellow. He looked quiet, almost lost in thought. "Are you tired, Dad?" I asked. He shook his head. "No, just thinking." "About what?" He smiled. "About how fast you grew up." I didn't answer. I just looked down at my cup of tea. For a while we said nothing. Then he reached into his bag. "I brought something for you," he said. He handed me a small brown paper bag. It looked simple, old, but carefully folded. "What is it?" I asked. "Open it," he said. I opened the bag slowly. Inside was a pair of wool gloves. They were soft, hand-knitted, a little uneven in shape. My heart stopped for a moment. "Do you remember these?" he asked. I touched them. "They look like Mum's work." He nodded. "Yes. She made them before she got sick." I looked at him, unable to speak. He continued softly. "She wanted you to have them when you left home. But I couldn't find them then. I found them last week in an old drawer." I held the gloves tightly. The wool felt rough, but warm. The smell reminded me of winter mornings at home. Mom cooking breakfast, Dad fixing the door, me laughing in the yard. Those sounds came back, clear and soft. "She always worried about you," he said. She said, "Our daughter's hands are small. They will get cold easily." His voice trembled a little. I looked down and my eyes were wet. "Dad," I whispered. He smiled gently. "Don't cry. She would want you to smile." I nodded, but the tears still came. He reached out and touched my hair, like he used to when I was a child. "You've done well," he said. "I know it's not easy here. But you are strong. Just don't forget home." I couldn't say anything. I only put on the gloves. They were a little big, but they felt like a hug. Outside, the wind blew against the window. Inside, everything was quiet. My father looked at me, his eyes kind and full of something I couldn't name. Something like love and time, and all the words we never said. That night, I didn't sleep. I watched the gloves on the table under the yellow light. They were simple, like everything my parents ever gave me, but they carried a warmth no city could ever give. Morning came too soon. The sky was pale and cold. I woke up early and made breakfast, eggs, bread, and hot tea. My father was already up, folding his blanket again. "Did you sleep well?" I asked. He smiled. "I slept like a log. Your bed is soft." I laughed. "I'm glad." We ate quietly. I didn't want to look at the clock, but I could hear time moving fast. The train would leave at 9. I didn't want him to go yet. When we left the apartment, he carried his bag himself. "I can take it," I said. He shook his head. "No need, it's light." The street was busy, full of people rushing to work. He walked slowly, looking around one last time. "This city is full of stories," he said. I smiled. "Yes, and you are now part of mine." At the train station, he bought a bottle of water. He handed it to me. "For later," he said. I took it and smiled. "Dad, I should be the one giving you water." He laughed. "Old habits die hard." When the train bell rang, my heart tightened. "Don't send me too far," he said. I nodded, but I still walked with him to the gate. He turned and looked at me. "Take care of yourself," he said softly. "I will," I said. "You too, Dad." He nodded. "Don't work too hard. Eat warm food. Sleep enough." "I know." He looked at me for a long time, as if trying to remember my face. Then he smiled. "You've grown up, May." He stepped onto the train. The door closed slowly. I waved, and he waved back. The train started to move. He was still smiling through the window. I stood there until the train was gone. The sound faded, but the feeling stayed. My eyes burned, and tears rolled down my cheeks. Outside, the wind was sharp and cold. I took out the gloves and put them on. They were warm, soft, and a little big. I held my hands together and took a deep breath. On my way home, the city looked different. The same buildings, the same streets, but somehow softer. Maybe it was me who changed. I thought of my father sitting on the train, maybe looking out the window, maybe thinking about home, maybe thinking about me. When I reached my room, the flowers on the table had opened a little more. The sunlight fell across the gloves, bright and gentle. I touched them and smiled. For the first time in a long while, the city didn't feel so cold. It felt like home.